Yep, go ahead and sign in.
I have a quick question before we get started.
Yeah, what's up?
So I took the quiz and I didn't do bad on wrong, but I want to retake it. Do we only have one option, like one chance to take it this time around?
There should be 2 attempts. Let me pull that up here and see what's going on.
Okay, because it didn't let me do attempt two.
Yeah, that's a mistake. Let's see here. We're talking about the last quiz.
Yes, the last one.
Yeah, that is not set correctly. Thank you for bringing that to to my attention.
Yeah, of course.
I apologize. I am fighting a cough today. I think it's allergies. Don't worry. I'm pretty sure I don't have coronavirus. I'm just I've been fighting a cough this morning, so I apologize for all the throat clearing. All right, so that should be fixed now. And while we're here looking at the Canvas page, let's just review some due dates. So that 5th quiz is due on the 30th in a couple of days. So those of you who haven't done it yet have some time. And if you've done your first attempt, now your second attempt should be working. The 3rd essay assignment was due on the 23rd. That was 5 days ago. There are some folks who haven't turned it in yet. If you are one of those people, please do go ahead and get it turned in. Better to take a late penalty than a 0, as I always say. And if you doubt that, you can easily do the math. You can go into the grade book and do an as-if grade, and you can compare a 0 to, say, a 70 or an 80 or whatever you would probably get with the late penalty at this point. And you will see that a 70 or an 80 is going to have a much less negative impact on your overall grade than a 0. So I would encourage you to do that if you haven't already. And I am working on the final exam not as we speak, because I'm teaching as we speak, but I have been working on the final exam, the 4th exam. Right now, I just have that there as a placeholder, so you can plug in an as-if grade if you want to, but I'm going to replace that with the actual exam here pretty soon once I finish writing it. And I anticipate 50 to 60 multiple choice questions from chapters 12 through, I think it's, 12 through, it's social psychology through the end of the book. So I think that's chapters 12 through 15, if I'm remembering correctly. I'll have a study guide posted for that as well. But it will be an open book exam. However, don't take that to mean that you don't have to study, because there is going to be a time limit on there, so that if you look up every single answer, you will end up running out of time on the exam. So what I would like to see you guys do is study as if it weren't open book. That way you only have to look up the answers that you don't know, and you know most of them, and you won't run out of time. Don't forget that there are a couple of extra credit opportunities that have been open here for a while. The gender discussion and the psychology and film. If you haven't done either of those yet, you still have some time to get those in, and I'll be grading those of you who have done those. I'll have the final exam posted and open for you guys most likely by Friday. That's the plan, and it will be due, I want to say, next Tuesday, I think, is according to the final exam schedule. So I want to say you guys will have from Friday through Tuesday to get the final exam done. And I'll be working on getting those third essays graded during that time as well. I'll try to get those done in a timely fashion. So I think that covers the house cleaning issues. We're on the home stretch here. We're going to finish up chapter 14 today on mental illnesses. This is our third day on chapter 14. And that's going to leave us only one day to cover chapter 15 on treatments. So if we get to the point where I run out of time on Thursday and I'm not able to cover everything in chapter 15, I will just go ahead and record a supplemental lecture that will cover the things that I don't make it through on Thursday. That way I've lectured on everything that I want to include on the final. All right, I think that does it for announcements. So I think most of you guys have signed in at this point. If you haven't, please go ahead and do so. And we'll go ahead and resume chapter 14 with a discussion first of schizophrenia. All right, so last time we finished with bipolar disorder, and we had some good discussion about that. And it would make sense to go to schizophrenia next, because there are some interesting overlaps between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. For one thing, both disorders are highly heritable, meaning that they tend to run in families. So that's one commonality. Another commonality is that they both tend to emerge during late adolescence or young adulthood. So if you make it to the age of 40 without getting diagnosed with bipolar disorder or with schizophrenia, chances are you'll probably go the rest of your life without receiving either of those diagnoses. Another interesting overlap is that although bipolar disorder is technically considered a mood disorder, there are occasions in which bipolar disorder can become what's known as a psychotic disorder. And when we say that a disorder is a psychotic disorder, we mean fundamentally that the individual has in some way lost touch with reality. So to say that someone is psychotic means that they've lost their grip on reality in some fundamental way or multiple ways. By definition, schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder, but there are cases that have been observed clinically where people have gone into manic episodes that have been so severe that they actually start to lose touch with reality and develop delusional beliefs, and in some extreme cases, even hallucinations. So that's relatively rare, but it's not unheard of. So that's another interesting overlap between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Finally, the last commonality that I'd like to mention is that some of the same medications that are used to treat bipolar manic episodes, in that context, they're referred to as mood stabilizers. Some of those same mood stabilizers that can be used to treat bipolar disorder can also be used as antipsychotics to treat schizophrenia. For example, the mood stabilizer Seroquel is a mood stabilizer when given to people with bipolar disorder. It helps prevent manic episodes. However, if you give Seroquel to someone with schizophrenia, you call it an antipsychotic, because it can also reduce some of the delusional and hallucinatory symptoms of schizophrenia. So a lot of commonalities there. With that said, they are technically different disorders and they have some notable differences. For one, schizophrenia is a lot less common than bipolar disorder, less than 1% of the population, as opposed to 3 to 4% of the population with bipolar disorder. Also, schizophrenia is considered a more serious mental illness. Not to say that bipolar disorder is not a serious mental illness, but schizophrenia is markedly more debilitating and harder to control than bipolar disorder tends to be. So what are we talking about when we talk about schizophrenia? We're talking about a psychotic disorder, and it's characterized by a split between thought and emotion. That's what the word schizo actually means, is split. And for this reason, sometimes people will mistake or confuse schizophrenia with multiple personality disorder. Because with multiple personality disorder, which we'll talk about later, you see split personalities. However, that's not what we're talking about with schizophrenia. When we talk about the split in schizophrenia, we're talking about a split between thought and emotion, meaning that normally in most healthy folks, thoughts and emotions are connected with each other. So thoughts evoke emotions, and when we express our thoughts out loud, oftentimes we do so with emotion. However, a person with schizophrenia often presents as having a very flat affect, a lack of emotion. Emotional statements that would normally invoke displays of emotion more commonly in folks who have schizophrenia don't invoke any emotion whatsoever. So if you speak to a person with schizophrenia whose mother just died, they might express it in a way such as this: my mom just died, right? Or my mom is dead. Complete lack of emotion. Normally, if someone's mother had just died, assuming that you didn't hate your mother and that you had a good relationship with your mom, most people would express that thought with some sadness, right? But there's going to be a lack of emotional presentation in individuals who have schizophrenia, most of the time anyway, with some exceptions. So there's a split between thought and emotion, and there's also a split between the person and reality, right? So fundamentally, the person has lost touch with reality in some fundamental ways, primarily as we see through delusional beliefs and hallucinatory symptoms. So there's a pattern of altered thoughts, altered perceptions, and altered conscious experiences. And the person experiencing the psychotic episode has difficulty distinguishing what is real from what isn't. Less than 1% of the population, as I mentioned, suffers from this mental illness. And the rates for men and women tend to be similar, unlike what we see with, say, major depressive disorder, where twice as many women are diagnosed with depression as men. So we see this cluster of symptoms, often bizarre motor behavior patterns. We have a video that we're going to watch in a second where we're actually going to see some real patients with schizophrenia, and you will see all of these symptoms on display. You see bizarre motor tics, cognitive distortions, behavioral abnormalities, behaving in very strange, bizarre ways, perceptual abnormalities in terms of perceiving things that aren't there, having beliefs about the world that aren't true, delusions and hallucinations. Ultimately, these symptoms lead to a profound inability to function in life. And a person having a full-blown psychotic episode who has schizophrenia is a person that is profoundly affected by this. It's like you can't hold a job down. You can't keep your interpersonal relationships together. It is a profoundly debilitating state to be in when you're having a full-blown psychotic episode. These symptoms have to be in place for at least 6 months in order for the diagnosis to be received. And you also have to rule out other medical conditions, such as dementia, such as drug abuse. For example, if someone's doing LSD every day, they might behave in a way that's very similar to a person that has schizophrenia, right? Because they're hallucinating. So you want to rule out drug use. You want to rule out various forms of dementia. Even severe hyperthyroidism can cause some of these symptoms. And the symptoms have to be in place for at least 6 months. So the symptoms of schizophrenia can broadly be categorized under 2 clusters of symptoms. You have the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms. When we talk about positive symptoms, we're not talking about good symptoms. And when we talk about negative symptoms, we're not talking about bad symptoms. Positive just means things that are there that shouldn't be. They're excesses in functioning. Negative symptoms are things that you would want to see in a healthy person, but are absent. So these are deficits in functioning. Positive, excesses; negative, deficits, right? So let's unpack these positive and negative symptoms. The positive symptoms of schizophrenia are symptoms 1 through 4 on this list. So one of the hallmarks of schizophrenia are the presence of persistent delusional beliefs. When I volunteered at Lakeview Center several years ago when I was in graduate school, I had a client that I briefly interacted with who had schizophrenia, who believed that a local country music station was spreading rumors about him on the radio, and spreading a rumor in town that he was gay. And he believed that the reason why he couldn't find a date with a woman was because this country music station was spreading rumors about him. And he also believed that they were broadcasting his thoughts. And he also believed that there was just this conspiracy in town to keep him from being able to get a date with a woman, right? So that's a delusion of persecution. Yeah.
Did he claim that he had heard it said on the radio, or that they were saying it while he was not listening to the radio?
Yeah, and that's an important question to ask, right? So, and I was a little unclear on that myself, and I only interacted with this client once in sort of an intake fashion, and I didn't end up being this person's therapist. But had that individual said that he actually heard this in an auditory fashion, then that would have been an auditory hallucination. But if this was just a belief that he had had, then it would be considered a delusion, right? So that's an important distinction to make, and I'm glad that you brought that up. And it's my understanding that it's just something that he believed, that he hadn't actually heard, but I could be mistaken on that. I think it was just a delusional belief and not something he had actually had a sensory experience of. If he had actually had a sensory experience of that, then that would have been an auditory hallucination. But what he was describing sounded an awful like a delusion of persecution. This belief that people were conspiring to keep him from being able to get a date for some reason. Sometimes folks with schizophrenia will have referential delusions. A prime example of this you'll see in the movie A Beautiful Mind, which stars Russell Crowe. And that movie is based on a true story, although I think there were some Hollywood embellishments in that movie to some degree. But it's based on the true story of the Nobel Prize-winning economist John Nash, who, if I'm remembering correctly, was an economics professor at Columbia University until he passed away a couple of years ago. But John Nash suffered from profound schizophrenia, and he had some really serious episodes throughout his adult life where he had to be institutionalized. And one of his delusions that would present when he was having an episode was that he believed that newspapers contained secret coded messages for him from the CIA. So he believed that he was working for the CIA and that there was some secret mathematical formula where he could decode the secret messages in newspaper articles, and that somehow this was related to the Cold War, and that the communists were secretly communicating with each other through newspaper articles in a coded fashion, and that if he could just decode the hidden communications in the newspapers and feed this information onto the CIA, then he could prevent World War III from happening. He could prevent a nuclear war from happening, right? So he had this delusional belief, and for a time, his office wall was just covered with newspaper clippings and underlined articles and highlighted articles where he believed that these secret messages were being sent from communists in Russia to their spies living in the United States. And he would send his findings to the CIA, and he, I think with some degree of chagrin on their part, like, what the hell's wrong with this guy, right? Why, who is this crazy professor sending us this nonsense? But he really believed he was working for the CIA, which was kind of a delusion of grandiosity. But he also had these referential delusions. You know, and he was actually a gifted Nobel Prize winning economist. So, you know, there was this sort of connection that we sometimes see between genius and madness. And sometimes we see artistic geniuses, like we talked about last time, commonly have bipolar disorder, right? So maybe there really is some kind of connection between genius and madness to some degree. Although I think maybe that connection might be overly played up and stereotyped a little bit. But he was certainly an illustration of that. Some folks might develop delusions of identity, where you'll have a schizophrenic patient believe they're Jesus Christ or the Prophet Muhammad or something like that, or they'll believe that they're the President of the United States. Delusions of guilt. Some folks with schizophrenia have this delusion that they're murdering people with their thoughts, right? That's a guilt delusion. Delusions of control. Some folks have delusions, for example, that their thoughts are being controlled by other people, right? That they don't have any control over the contents of their own mind, and that other people, or maybe the government, is controlling their thoughts. So all of these are different varieties of delusional beliefs, but these are common sorts of delusions that you will see among individuals suffering from schizophrenia. The other way in which you will see a disconnect from reality are through the presence of hallucinations. So as I mentioned before, a delusion is a false belief about the world. A hallucination is actually a sensory experience that is not based upon sensory input. So normally when we have a sensory experience, for example, if you hear something, it's because sound waves are stimulating your eardrums. If you see something, it's because light waves are striking your retina. But when you hallucinate, that sensory stimulation is not occurring, but you're having the experience of something that is not actually happening in your external world, right? And these hallucinations can take the form of any sense. You know, they can be full-blown visual hallucinations, although most commonly they're going to be tactile hallucinations or olfactory, meaning smells or the feeling of being touched. Also, auditory hallucinations are very common. Visual hallucinations are actually some of the least common hallucinations that you'll see in people with schizophrenia, but they're not unheard of. It can happen. But more often than not, there either will be auditory or olfactory or tactile, but any of your senses can be subject to hallucination. Disorganized speech patterns we'll see very clearly in the video that I'm going to play in a minute. This is the inability to make it from point A to point B in a single sentence. There is this lack of ability to make sense whatsoever. Yeah.
So with the schizophrenic patients that you have experience with, how common was hearing other entities speak to them, like hearing voices in their heads, and how often was that voice inside their head like the devil?
Yeah, so I only had a couple of patients with schizophrenia that I ever interacted with. My clinical experience was relatively limited, but you know, in my experience, auditory hallucinations are among the most common, and I don't know how often they perceive the devil speaking to them. But the two patients with schizophrenia that I did interact with seemed to show symptoms of auditory hallucinations and hearing voices. And one theory is that they are mistaking their own thoughts for an external voice, right? Most of us know our own thoughts as our thoughts, right? But one theory is that a person with schizophrenia, when they're hearing voices, they mistake their own thoughts for an exterior voice, which is one theory. And I don't know how much research support there is for it, but I know that's one popular theory of auditory hallucinations. And I think auditory hallucinations are among the most common types of hallucinations that you'll see. And this disorganized speech that I was talking about is so profound. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. These individuals often cannot put a sentence together that makes an iota of sense whatsoever. Disorganized behavior is just sort of a catch-all term for just erratic, unpredictable behavior patterns. So those are the 4 positive symptoms of schizophrenia. The negative symptoms, these are deficits of functioning, and negative symptoms, for whatever reason, seem to be more serious, more intense among male patients, for whatever reason. And I don't know why that might be the case, but the negative symptoms displayed by male patients with schizophrenia seem to be a little bit more intense than the negative symptoms shown by female patients. But it's a lack of emotion when speaking, slowed speech, long pauses, lack of eye contact is a common symptom, or when they're asked a question, they might give an answer that's completely unrelated to the question that was asked. Like, so, Mr. Carr, what are we doing in class today? I really like Radiohead. I think they're a great band, right? Just totally not answering the question, but the answer would be a lot more nonsensical than that, right? And it's really hard to imitate, actually, because it's so beyond rational speaking that if you're in a healthy, normal state of mind, you have to be a really good actor to imitate this sort of disorganized speech. And we'll go ahead and take a look at it now, actually. So I'm going to pause the recording because I don't want to get my video taken off of YouTube for a copyright violation. If you're watching the recording, shoot me an email. I'll send you a link to the video that I'm about to finding me. Yeah. So yeah, we see in that video a lot of the symptoms that I've been discussing, and we see the lack of emotional display. We see the speech monotony. But interestingly enough, we also see the pattern that's talked about in that slide there, where the negative symptoms seem to be, on average, more pronounced in male patients for whatever reason. The one female patient that we saw there, she showed a significantly increased level of emotional expression compared to the male patients. And that is a pattern that seems to be relatively stable across patients with schizophrenia, on average, at least. When it comes to the etiology of schizophrenia, we definitely are still in the beginning stages of understanding exactly what's going wrong in the brain. There is an understanding that schizophrenia is primarily a brain disorder, but we don't know the specifics as much as we would like. We do know that it's highly heritable. There have been a number of twin studies, for example, that have shown that schizophrenia runs in families, and that if you have a close relative that has schizophrenia, you're much more likely to develop the disorder yourself. So genetics plays a strong role, but genetics is not necessarily destiny. We know that there is an environmental component, especially in terms of exposure to stress. So for example, we also know that schizophrenia is more likely to develop in urban environments. There's been a fair amount of research that has shown that the rates of schizophrenia are highly increased in urban environments. Even when you account for population size, people develop schizophrenia at a much greater rate than urban environments. So one hypothesis is that there's just something stressful about living in a big city that maybe plays on that genetic vulnerability. We know that neurotransmitters are involved in some way or another, and there has been a dopamine hypothesis about schizophrenia for a number of years, that schizophrenia could possibly be due to some excess of dopamine in certain areas of the brain. One line of research that seems to support this hypothesis is that if you take Parkinson's disease medication and give it to a person who does not have Parkinson's disease, it will often induce symptoms that are very similar to schizophrenia. So going back to chapter 2, you might recall that Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder that is characterized by the destruction of, or the death of the neurons that produce dopamine in the midbrain, in the structure called the substantia nigra. So those neurons start to die off, and the brain starts to lose its ability to produce dopamine in mass, and this eventually results in the motor symptoms and cognitive symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So the medication that treats Parkinson's disease, the most commonly used medication, is a medication called L-DOPA, which is a medication that artificially increases dopamine levels in the brain. It's basically like an artificial dopamine, basically. It's dopamine that you're getting externally through a pill, to oversimplify a little bit. But what the drug essentially does is it causes an increase in those dopamine levels in the brain to help offset the loss of dopamine that's happening as a result of the loss of those neurons. Well, if you give that drug that increases dopamine levels in the brain to a person who doesn't have Parkinson's disease, there have been some studies that have shown that you can actually get schizophrenia-like symptoms if you artificially heighten dopamine levels in the brain in that way. So that's one line of research. There are also some other lines of research that might suggest that there might be some link to excesses in serotonin as well. And again, I'm not an expert in this, and that's about all I know about that. I haven't really studied that in an in-depth fashion, but there is the dopamine hypothesis. There's also a serotonin hypothesis. Perhaps both neurotransmitters are involved in some way in terms of an excess of these neurotransmitters. So that's one hypothesis. Yeah.
Is there a comorbidity of insomnia and schizophrenia?
You know, that's a good question, and I don't actually know the answer to that. I know that there's a comorbidity between sleep disorders and depression. So interestingly, some folks with depression will sleep all day. Other folks with depression don't get enough sleep. I'm not, you know, I can do a quick search here and see, because I'm actually not, I'm not entirely sure as to the answer to that question. Let's see.
The reason why I ask is because I know that when you sleep less, it alters your levels of serotonin and dopamine.
It would make sense. Yeah, it would. Let's see.
So usually people who sleep less, you know, especially if it's like frequently that they do it, they have higher levels of dopamine. You know, they tend to be like really fast, kind of like paranoid and stuff. You know, it's just like mild schizophrenic symptoms. Schizotypicalism.
It looks like you might be onto something there, and I wasn't actually aware of this, but it would logically make sense, like you said. And I'm just going by this quick Google result from psychiatryadvisor.com, which I think you guys should be able to see on screen. It says symptoms of insomnia, such as the ability to fall or stay asleep and daytime sleepiness, affect 80% of patients diagnosed with schizophrenia and frequently coincide with the prodromal stage, periods of relapse, and experience of positive symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. So 80%, yeah. So I would say that the answer to your question appears to be yes. And
yes.
Yeah. So that, you know, I didn't actually know that prior to this. So, you know, I love it when I am learning things myself from my students and from lectures, and, you know, I never want to stop learning, and I'm learning new things every day from you guys. So cool. Yeah. So that's another symptom that I could possibly add to my slides in the future. That's good to know. So yeah, schizophrenia is a debilitating medical condition, and if you have schizophrenia, chances are pretty high that you're going to need to be on medication for the rest of your life in order to manage it. And you're probably going to need to be under the supervision of a psychiatrist. There are folks who have schizophrenia who surmount the odds and live relatively productive, good lives, like John Nash comes to mind, the character from A Beautiful Mind. He was able to get his schizophrenia under control with medical help, and he went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics, and he retired from teaching, I believe it was at Columbia University, a really well-respected and successful economist. So that was a success story. Another success story, if you're interested in checking it out on your own time, there's a TED Talk by a UCLA law professor who has schizophrenia. And she has, it was debilitating when she was younger, when she was in graduate school, but she was able to get it under control with medication and psychotherapy. And she's had it managed for years now. And she's a very well-respected, highly regarded law professor from the University of California at Los Angeles. And her TED Talk is pretty inspiring. And she's beat the odds and managed it. Unfortunately, there are a lot of folks who aren't as affluent as the two professors I've just mentioned who've had schizophrenia, and particularly folks from lower income backgrounds. You know, a disproportionate number of homeless people have schizophrenia. If you really want to experience this firsthand, go visit San Francisco sometime. And if you walk through certain neighborhoods, like the Tenderloin comes to mind, you're practically having to step over people on the sidewalk who are homeless people suffering from schizophrenia. And I had one incident when my wife and I were walking through that neighborhood, which was probably a bad idea to begin with. But my wife and I were walking through that neighborhood, and there was a homeless man who had schizophrenia who was verbally harassing us, and he started to it was looking like he was going to start getting physical with us for a second. He was following us, and I hate that I had to do this, but I had to grab the person by his shirt, and I pushed him against the wall of the building we were walking by, and let him know that it wasn't going to work out well for him if he kept harassing us. And I'm not normally an aggressive person, but that guy was being really, he was escalating, and I thought he was starting to get dangerous. So I needed to send a message to that guy that if you act like you're going to put your hands on me or my wife, then we're going to have serious issues. And I felt bad for slamming a mentally ill person against a wall, but I felt like I really didn't have very many options in that situation. This guy was totally off his rockers, and harassing my wife and I as we were walking by. So in any case, I don't normally make a habit of physically assaulting individuals who have mental illness, but in this case, I didn't have much of a choice in the situation. But if you visit a city like San Francisco or New York City, you will see what I'm talking about. Lots and lots of homeless people seem to have this mental illness, and it's pretty obvious who has it within just seconds of interacting with some of them. And one thing that happened back in the 1980s was a social movement known as deinstitutionalization. There was a social movement, largely was kind of politically driven, but there was this idea that it was unethical to lock people up their whole lives in institutions. So you had all of these folks who were locked up in state institutions with schizophrenia, and then this movement towards deinstitutionalization took place. And the idea was like we were going to release these people into the community and just manage their mental illness on an outpatient basis. And one theory is that because of this movement towards deinstitutionalization that happened back in the 80s and early 90s, this is the reason why we have so many homeless people now on the streets of our big cities like New York City, like Chicago, like San Francisco is the worst of them all. But I think deinstitutionalization could partially be to blame, at least, for a lot of these homeless folks out there who seem to be mentally ill. In fact, here on Olive Road, where I live, up the road from me, there's a new Circle K at the intersection of Olive and Davis. And if you ever drive by that Circle K on a lot of evenings around between 5 to 7 o'clock, I would say is usually when she's out there, there's an elderly woman, and I've never spoken to her. I don't know what her story is, but there's an elderly woman who sits in a chair on the sidewalk in front of the Circle K at Olive and Davis, and she just sits in this chair talking to herself, right? And I don't know if she's homeless, but I suspect that she probably is, and I suspect that she probably has schizophrenia, right? So, if you're ever driving by that Circle K between 5 to 7 o'clock p.m. Look on the sidewalk in front of the Circle K, and the chances are you'll see this woman that I'm talking about sitting out there in this chair. I think it's like a lawn chair or something. She's just sitting there muttering to herself for hours and hours as traffic goes by. Really kind of sad when you think about it, and when you look at it, it's a sad situation.
Mr. Carr?
Yeah.
I was going to suggest that, with such a high correlation of, sleep disorders with schizophrenia, perhaps a good alternative treatment would be to treat the sleeping problem. And perhaps, if they were sleeping a full 8 hours every night consistently for a period of time, the symptoms would be alleviated.
Yeah, and I think you're probably onto something there. And interestingly enough, most of the effective antipsychotic medications that treat schizophrenia, like Thorazine, Halidal, Seroquel is a newer one. One of their primary effects is that they're highly sedating. So if you take a dose of Seroquel or Thorazine or Halidal, you're probably going to go to bed afterwards, right? So those are medications that you would take at night, and perhaps to some degree, perhaps maybe some of their helpfulness is caused by the fact that these people are now getting more sleep after they take the medication. And we do have some effective medications like that. Now, the old treatment for schizophrenia was lobotomy, but then medications like Thorazine and Haldol and later Seroquel were developed, and they can pretty effectively treat these symptoms. The problem is getting people to comply, to stay on their medications. A lot of folks don't want to stay on their medications because a lot of folks with schizophrenia already are paranoid. So they'll have this paranoia about the medications, like maybe the doctors are trying to poison them to death or something. And another problem is that the medications often have some nasty side effects that result. So, the question is, though, do you want to be debilitated by hallucinations and delusional beliefs for the rest of your life, or do you want to have to deal with some side effects, but at least be in touch with reality and be able to live a productive life? So that's a heavy trade-off. Porcelain, yeah.
So I know that people with OCD, they realize that what they're doing isn't really rational. Is that the same case with schizophrenia, or do they just not have that same level of awareness?
So a person in a full-blown psychotic episode, they're going to be less aware of the fact that they're out of touch with reality. Now, once you get the episode under control with medication and get them back to being rebalanced, then they might kind of come to and realize, oh, wow, I just had a psychotic episode. But when they're in the thick of it, one of the last things that you actually want to try to do as a therapist or a mental health worker is actually try to argue with someone about their delusions and their hallucinations. Because when they're going through it, it's very real to them. And there is usually not an awareness that they're actually hallucinating or they're actually suffering from a delusional belief. So if a person is actively psychotic, you want to get them medicated, you want to get the hallucinations and the delusions under control. And once you do that, then you can start to reason with them a little bit. But trying to do psychotherapy or talk therapy with someone who is actively psychotic is a fool's errand. And you're actually likely to aggravate the person to the point where they might even become combative if you try to challenge their hallucinations or their delusional beliefs. So I would say the answer to your question in most cases would be no. So we have a little bit of time left to talk about some other mental illnesses. I do want to try to get to the end of the chapter today. We've got about 20 minutes left. So, schizophrenia is eminently interesting. And there's some interesting lectures on YouTube about schizophrenia. And if you guys want to explore this topic further, I can, there's a particular lecture I'm thinking of by a Stanford psychology professor by the name of Robert Sapolsky. And he's a really talented lecturer. And I'm reading one of his books right now called Behave. But he has some lectures on the biology of mental illness. He's got some good lectures on depression, and he's got a really good lecture on schizophrenia. So if anybody's interested in exploring this further, I'd be glad to send you some of those links to some of his lectures that I've found really informative. And he's lecturing at a more advanced level than we get into in an intro level course. But if you really want to dive into this stuff, I really recommend looking up the lectures of Robert Sapolsky on YouTube. So I want to talk a little bit about disorders of self, which your textbook, it's a category that your textbook breaks down into two subcategories, which are your personality disorders and your dissociative disorders. And we could spend an entire semester just exploring the personality disorders. So I apologize that I'm not going to be able to do these any kind of justice today. I'm kind of flying through these because I want to try to get through the rest of the chapter. And in fact, there are some on this slide that I'm not even going to talk about and let you guys read about on your own. But I'm going to kind of focus on cluster B a little bit because they're the most dramatic and well-known personality disorders. Personality disorders in general tend to be more difficult to treat because it seems like they're more of a deeply ingrained part of a person's personality. Hence personality disorders, almost kind of like they're a part of you to some degree. But the most well-known personality disorders come from cluster B, which are your dramatic, emotional, erratic behavior patterns. And probably the three most well-known personality disorders would be antisocial, borderline, and narcissistic. So I want to kind of focus on those three for a minute. And again, if you want to read about the others, you're welcome to in your textbook. And I would encourage that, but these are kind of some of the stars of the show. So we've talked about psychopathy in the past. And in fact, I think very recently we were talking about psychopathy. An interesting thing about psychopathy is that it's actually not a DSM diagnosis. And when we talk about psychopaths, often we think about serial killers. We think about folks who are cold-blooded, who don't experience any empathy for others, and don't experience fear. And there's definitely a dark side to psychopathy, but there's also some interesting ways, like we talked about before, in which psychopathy might be an adaptation to some degree, which could allow you to operate in the world without being hindered by irrationality, without being hindered by emotions. And that's the basic argument that's given in a book that I read recently called The Wisdom of Psychopaths, which is an interesting take on psychopathy, because usually psychopathy is framed in terms of evil, right? Serial killers and that sort of thing. But it's a book that actually tries to look at the bright side of psychopathy. But interestingly enough, psychopathy is not a DSM diagnosis. You can get diagnosed as a psychopath. It's just not a diagnosis that's in the DSM, interestingly enough. The closest equivalent in the DSM, and it's not a perfect overlap, would be antisocial personality disorder. So antisocial personality disorder is a personality characterized by a disregard for the rights of other people and a disregard for the feelings of other people, right? And you could make an argument that you could be a psychopath without being a sociopath, which a sociopath would be someone who has antisocial personality disorder. And there's a lot of overlap between the two, but purely by definition, psychopathy is defined by your lack of emotional reactions to things, right? So you could be a good, productive member of society and not be an asshole to people, right? You could be aware of the fact that you're a psychopath and you could have it under control, and you could behave in a way that is socially acceptable, and you could just be kind of an emotionless kind of person who, you know, doesn't have a lot of empathy for other people, but still behaves and still follows the rules, right? So interestingly, you could make an argument that you could be a psychopath without being a sociopath. But sociopaths, by definition, are folks who often have trouble following the rules. These are folks who don't like authority. They have no problem violating the rights of other people. Sociopaths are the types of folks who are likely to rob someone at gunpoint and shoot them. They're likely the types of people who are likely to end up in prison, getting into a lot of fights, that sort of thing. So there's a correlation between antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, but it's not a perfect overlap, right? And that's an interesting thing to note. Borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder that's characterized by having unstable moods, unstable personal relationships, an unstable sense of self, and sort of an impulsive personality. I actually dated someone who had borderline personality disorder when I was younger. Not my wife, by the way. My wife is a very well-adjusted, intelligent, bright, wonderful woman, and I'm very lucky to have been with her for over the past 10 years. I'm an extremely lucky man. She's also beautiful too. So I'm not talking about my wife here. I want to be clear on that. But someone who I dated for many years, this was actually my high school sweetheart. I met my wife when I was in college. But the person who I dated for most of my high school years and into my freshman year of college, so an ex of mine had borderline personality disorder, and she was actually diagnosed with it. And the classic book that was written about borderline excuse me, the classic book that was written about borderline personality disorder is called "I Hate You, Don't Leave Me." And that pretty much sums up what it was like to be with my ex who had borderline personality disorder. You wake up in the morning and she's showering me with affection, right? I'm the best thing that's ever happened to her in her life, and she doesn't know what she would do without me. Very clingy, very emotionally needy. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I love you so much. That afternoon, after lunch, something changes in her brain, and I am now the worst thing that's ever happened to her. I'm a son of a bitch, and she wishes she never would have met me. I'm the worst thing that's ever happened to her, and she hates me and just wants me to leave her alone, and she never wants to talk to me again. And she dumps me. Next morning, I get a phone call. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that. I was just in a bad mood. Please don't leave me. Please take me back. I love you so much. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. And by the way, if you don't take me back, I'm going to kill myself." Right? That's how she behaved, right? And sometimes she would cut herself, and she would engage in self-harming behaviors. And she had these extreme mood swings and impulsivity. And from one moment to the next, she either hated me or I was the best thing that ever happened to her, right? And I'm not saying these things to denigrate individuals who have borderline personality disorder. If there's anyone in this class who is diagnosed with it, I don't say these things to make you feel bad about yourself or to make fun of you, but that is just actually how she behaved. Does anybody here know anyone that has borderline personality disorder that has any similar sorts of experiences? Last period, I had someone who actually had it, who was diagnosed with it, who was talking about it. And that was an interesting perspective. So it's very difficult to be in a relationship with someone who has borderline personality disorder because their moods are so unstable, their sense of self is very unstable, and their relationships tend to be kind of all over the place. And I wish that person the best, by the way. I don't know how she's doing these days. I haven't kept in touch with her. She's not one of those people that you can break up with and stay friends with, right? If you couldn't tell by the way I was describing her. But I hope she's... What's that?
I have a question.
Sure.
How long did it last, if that's cool with you?
How long was I with her?
Yes.
2.5 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it was like an everyday thing?
Oh yeah, practically every day. And she also had a really bad habit of making stories up. So one time, for example, she went to work and she told, and this isn't listed in the symptoms here in the slide, but dishonesty is often another common symptom of borderline personality disorder. Should make stories up. One time she went to work and she told all of her coworkers that we had a child together. And she pulled out a picture of her brother's kid, her nephew, and she showed everybody at work this picture of her nephew and told everybody it was our kid. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I found out about it from one of her coworkers who, after the fact, who told me, who basically, I ran into one of her coworkers in public, and her coworker asked me how our little boy was doing. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And that was an awkward conversation that I had to have with her coworker. So,
Wow.
Jonathan, you says this sounds like your ex. Porcelain reminds you of your uncle. Yeah. So, again, I don't mean to denigrate anybody. If there's anybody here who has borderline personality disorder, I'm not saying that you're a bad person. It is a serious mental illness, and it makes it very difficult to maintain a relationship. Yeah, she told people that she was pregnant even though she wasn't. Yeah, that sounds about like my ex. Yeah. She did that to me once too. She told me she was pregnant when she wasn't. Yeah, it was kind of a traumatic relationship to go through. I got to be honest. And again, if you have this issue, I wish you the best. I'm not trying to speak ill of you or make you feel bad about yourself, but some serious symptoms. I'll talk about narcissistic personality disorder for a second, and then I need to move on because we're quickly running out of time today. Narcissistic personality disorder is a pattern of self-obsession and grandiosity, named, of course, after the Greek myth of Narcissus, who was a beautiful young man who was so obsessed with his own beauty, he got frozen staring at his own reflection in a pond, and he actually drowned and died in his own reflection, right? So narcissism is a pattern of self-obsession, this constant need for admiration, and a pattern of a lack of empathy for other people. And interestingly enough, there's often a comorbidity between antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. And someone who has both is a person who has a vast disregard for the well-being of others, and they're completely self-obsessed, and they're the type of person that you don't want to cross. So a narcissistic sociopath is the type of person who cannot take any type of criticism whatsoever, and they will violently lash out to get even with anyone who criticizes them in any way whatsoever. So that's something to be aware of, and that's kind of scary. Okay, so I'm going to have to move on from the personality disorders. And I want to talk a little bit about the dissociative disorders for a minute. These are the other category. This is the other category of disorders of self that your textbook talks about. There are two types of dissociative disorders. What dissociative disorders have in common is that they involve disruptions of your sense of personal identity, your memories, and your conscious awareness. So two types of dissociative disorders. The first one is dissociative amnesia. And this is a dissociative disorder that's a trauma response where a person experiences a traumatic event and they experience amnesia as a result of this trauma. So it's a trauma-induced amnesia. That's what's known as not dissociative identity disorder. I misspoke a second ago. This is what's known as dissociative amnesia. Dissociative identity disorder I'll talk about in a second. So dissociative amnesia is a trauma-based amnesia. Extreme cases of this are what's known as a dissociative fugue, where the person will actually forget who they are and take up a new identity and start living as someone else. There's an interesting movie about this called Nurse Betty, which came out a few years ago. If you're thinking about doing the extra credit assignment on psychology and film, Nurse Betty is a dark comedy about a woman who experiences dissociative amnesia after she witnesses a murder, I think it is, if I'm remembering correctly. She witnesses this traumatic event and it causes her to get amnesia, and she starts to believe that she's this character from a soap opera that she watches by the name of Nurse Betty. And she travels off to Hollywood living as this character from a soap opera and presents herself as Nurse Betty to strangers. And it's a dark comedy. And it covers the topic of dissociative amnesia in its most extreme form, the dissociative fugue. Here we have the most controversial of all mental health diagnoses, dissociative identity disorder. This is what's also known as multiple personality disorder. That was the old term for it. This is a mental illness that is overwhelmingly diagnosed in women who have experienced some form of extreme sexual abuse or extreme trauma as children. And it's a controversial diagnosis because a lot of mental health professionals believe that it doesn't even exist. It is in the DSM, so you can diagnose someone with it, but a lot of folks believe that it's a phony diagnosis. A lot of folks believe that these are women basically just acting and trying to get sympathy from people. And overwhelmingly, it's almost always women who get diagnosed with this. So these are folks who develop multiple personalities within the same person. And mental health professionals have gone back and forth for years as to whether or not this is a real disease. And there are some true believers. I had a psychology professor in graduate school, Dr. Jack Keller, who was a true believer in dissociative identity disorder. And he even brought a patient in once to class. He did a show and tell with a patient who he had diagnosed with it. And of course, she was a woman who had been severely sexually abused by her father during childhood and repeatedly, and she developed these multiple personalities apparently as a way to cope with that trauma. And one line of evidence that true believers use to support the idea that it really exists is that the handwriting patterns of the different personalities are often drastically different, as different as you would see in two different people, right? So that's one argument that's often used. I'm not sure what I believe about it. You know, this woman was pretty convincing, but you know, was she acting or not? I don't know. I can't really say. Porcelain says, I recommend checking out Dissocia DID on YouTube. They make very informative videos about their experiences. I'm willing to check that out. Yeah, I'm open-minded about it. So I neither believe nor disbelieve. I'm agnostic about dissociative identity disorder.
Mr. Carr,
Yeah.
I believe I have actually witnessed a case of this, which seems, you know, it's like supposed to be the most rare disorder in the world. But there's a guy in Tallahassee. He's a black guy, and he's got straightened hair, and he has a white personality and a black personality, right? So he walks around, like, I met this guy at the gas station. I was just being friendly, talking to him. He comes up to me, and he's, like, talking like, you know, like typical white guy, right? Like, he's got this, like, white guy accent going on. And then, like, mid like sentence, he gets this look on his face like he just forgot everything that was going on, like he just kind of blinks like this, and then he starts talking like in this black personality and had forgotten everything that he had said previously, like it never happened.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I have an open mind about it. And, you know, like I said, one of my professors in graduate school, he was a true believer, and this woman he brought into class was pretty convincing. So I'm pretty open-minded about it. And I wouldn't, you know, I'm open to the idea that it indeed is a real diagnosis. And I'm going to check out that YouTube station that Porcelain recommended. And I've never actually met anyone myself other than that person in class that had been diagnosed with it. But the guy from Tallahassee sounds like a really interesting case. And I'm wondering, does he have a social media presence, or is he well known outside of Tallahassee?
I don't know. It's just a chance meeting. So I have no idea who he is.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the last slide that I have for you guys, and we're just about to run out of time today. We've got 2 minutes left, but these are the neurodevelopmental disorders. And these are diagnoses that are almost always made during childhood. And we've talked about some of these already in class. So, you know, one of them is pretty controversial, ADHD. There are a lot of folks who believe that ADHD is overdiagnosed. And if you're really interested in that topic, I recommend a documentary on Netflix called Take Your Pills, which if you want to do your psychology and film response to that documentary, that would be another good choice. It's called Take Your Pills. It's on Netflix, and it's about ADHD and the medications that treat ADHD. And there's an argument that is made by some folks in that documentary that ADHD might be overdiagnosed, and that basically people are going to get the ADHD diagnosis just so they can get an Adderall, you know, prescription, which I think might be true for a lot of folks. Actually, I'm not positive on that, but I think that does happen. But we have run out of time. But I do want you guys to read over the neurodevelopmental disorders. A lot of them, like I said, we've already talked about to some level. in class. I talked about intellectual disability in chapter 8 on intelligence. I've talked about autism spectrum disorders at other points. So I'm going to have to leave these to you guys to read about on your own, because we've spent 3 days on chapter 14, and I need to leave at least one last class meeting on Thursday to cover mental health treatments. So that's the plan for Thursday. If you have not signed in today, please go ahead and do so. And I'll see you guys on Thursday. Stay safe and healthy. Always a good conversation with you guys. You guys always have some stimulating input. I learned some new things today. I didn't know about the insomnia connection, for example, with schizophrenia. So it's always a pleasure to learn things from my students. And I'm honored and humbled every day by you guys. And I appreciate you guys. Stay safe and healthy. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Sign in if you have it.
Bye. Thank you.
Later.
Hey, Mr. Carr, can you refresh my memory about the final for your class? What's the deal with it?
Yeah, so it's going to be chapters 12 through 15. So that's social psychology and everything we've covered since social psychology. So it'll be social psychology, personality theory, mental illnesses, and mental health treatment. And it's going to be probably 50 to 60 questions. It'll be open book. There will probably be a 2-hour time limit. I'm guessing either an hour and a half or 2 hours. I haven't decided yet. I will post a study guide. Yeah, so it'll just be chapters 12 through 15. No cumulative final in this class.
And it's going to take place when?
And it's going to open up on Friday, and I'm writing it right now. I'm writing it this week, and I'll have it open on Friday, and it'll be open through, I want to say, Tuesday of next week.
Okay.
So you'll have a...
Oh, yeah, you told us that it was not going to be a lockdown browser thing.
Right, yeah. I thought about using Lockdown Browser, but the problem that I have is that a small but sizable minority of students are using cell phones for this, and Lockdown Browser will not work on cell phones. So instead, I've just said to hell with it. I'll make it open book, but I'll put a time limit on it so that it should limit the amount of time that students can spend looking up answers. So you can look up answers if you want, but if you try to look up every single answer, unless you're really, fast with the textbook, then it'll make it harder to look up every answer. I mean, I realize that there's nothing that I can do ultimately to prevent folks from looking up answers, and part of me thinks I should have used the Lockdown Browser, but then I would have had like 15% of the class that wouldn't have been able to take the final because of that. It's just a tricky situation. So I'm just going to have it be open book, and even with it open book, the last couple of exams that I've done open book in my classes since we've gone on Zoom, the average scores have still been around 75 to 80%, even though they're open book. So that tells me that they're still sufficiently challenging exams, even though they're open book. But I wish there was something that I could do to.
Right. Yeah, there wouldn't be very many answers that you could search in that amount of time.
Right. So I'm just going to have more questions on the exam and a stricter time limit is how I'm combating that. So, cool.
All right. Cool.
All right.
Thank
Have
you.
a good afternoon.
Yeah, you too.
I just wanted to say that my uncle has schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom talks about how he used to be this great athlete in high school, and then he kind of just progressed worse.
Did he play football?
I think so.
Because that's interesting that you bring that up, because I had an uncle with schizophrenia, and he passed away back in the 80s. And so I never really got to know him, because actually he died a year before I was born. I was born in 84 and he died in 1983. But he was a high school football star when he was a teenager. And I think that was back in the 1940s or 50s when he played high school football. And he had some serious concussions when he was playing football. And then he later developed schizophrenia. So I'm wondering, if there might be, in many cases, a connection between concussions, head injuries, and the development of schizophrenia.
Yeah, and he lives in a home now, and I've never had a conversation with him, even though I see him a lot because his brother takes care of him sometimes.
Yeah.
I've never talked to him because he only smokes and grunts. I've never had a conversation with him.
Yeah, that's sad. Yeah, that's really unfortunate.
Um,
And I'm sorry that he has to live in that state. That's really, that's sad.
yeah, but he's my second favorite uncle out of like the four I have. So, so
Yeah. Well, it sounds like he's medicated at least, and it's managed to some degree.
uh, and so I did my essay on schizophrenia.
Okay, so how do you feel my presentation of schizophrenia lined up with your experiences with your uncle? Was it accurate to your understanding?
Yeah, and since I did the essay and really researched into it, I'm really happy that I did it on schizophrenia because I feel so. It makes me worry about him more, but I feel way more understood about what he may go through, you know.
Yeah, it's a brain disease, and he probably has very little control over his symptoms. And it sounds at least like he's under medical management. You said he lives in a group home?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like he's probably under the supervision of a psychiatrist and or a psychologist, and he's probably living a better life than he might have, had he not had access to that help. So, I guess maybe I'm too much of an optimist and I try to find the silver linings in things. But there are so many people out there on the streets living with unmanaged schizophrenia, with no meds, and it's a terribly sad reality that so many of our homeless people in this country are suffering from that illness, and there's nothing that apparently we can or are willing to do for these people as a society. And I have mixed feelings about deinstitutionalization, because on the one hand, the philosophy behind deinstitutionalization was the idea that you were giving people dignity by not locking them up in an institution their whole life, and giving people their freedom back. But on the one hand, by doing that, you were also cutting them off with the stability of a stable place to live, and 3 meals a day, a bed to sleep in, medications that they needed. I almost think that deinstitutionalization was actually inhumane. And I think it might have been the exact opposite of what the movement was actually aiming at. I don't know, just my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I have to go. This was great.
All right. Me too. All right. I'll see you guys on Thursday.
Yeah. Have a nice day.
You too.